And now I am thrilled to introduce Garth Johson, Curator of Recorded Matter. Garth is an artist, writer, curator, and educator. He joined the Arizona State University Art Museum as a Curator of Ceramics at the Ceramic Research Center in 2014. Before he joined ASU, he served as the Curator of Artistic Programs at the Clay Studio in Philadelphia. He spent 7 years as Associate Professor at the College of the Redwoods in California. He holds a BFA from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and an MFA from Alfred University. He recently served on the board of the National Council on Education for Ceramic Arts. Most of us know it as NCECA. And I'd like to ask you to join me in welcoming Garth Johson.
Yeah. All right, so I want to start out, I'm going to start out actually with a little palate cleanser. I've always loved the saying, writing about art or talking about art is like dancing about architecture. That's the saying. And I always assumed that it was Marcel Duchamp or some really mysterious surrealist who came up with that. Does anyone know who came up with the saying, talking about art is like dancing about architecture? Martin Mull, the comedian. So there were some similar things, similar sayings before that, but Martin Mull is actually the person who put that verbiage together. So I'm going to start with one of the videos from the exhibition. This is an artist who currently lives in Philadelphia and is a resident at the Clay Studio named Jason Lee Starrin. Thank you for the lights. So it's about an 8-minute video of hands squishing, kneading, smearing, and putting themselves into clay by firelight. You can see a few cinders kind of coming up. And I'm a person who loves to talk about art. I'm a person who loves to write about art. But this video accomplishes something that no single piece of ceramic art ever conveyed, in my opinion. This shows the pure, raw, electric sex of putting one's hands into clay. And I love the fact that AMOCA has a studio attached, and I don't know, just watching this makes me want to run into the studio and plunge my hand into the clay barrel and to start to squish it around. So I hope that this gets everybody in the mood. I'm going to be showing some video and talking about artists who use video and performance as a tool. And as most of you in the audience probably guessed, it's not an entirely new phenomenon. Jason Lee Starrin. So here's a shot of the outside of the ASU Art Museum, and if you haven't visited, I encourage everyone to make a little trip to Tempe and to come visit me. This is the open storage at the museum, so we have about 4,500 post-war pieces in our collection, and we can show about 700 of them at any one time. So these are all of the people that I get to visit every time that I walk through the space into my office. Hi, Toshiko Takaezu. Hi, a couple of our Robert Arnesons on display. So I count myself as very lucky every time that I walk through the door. Okay, so the title of this talk is Showing Making. And I'm going to talk about the history of people who have used clay in a performative way. And I'm going to showcase some of the young artists who are shown in our exhibition. And I'm going to start out with a little thought experiment. So I'm going to show you a really beautiful gossamer thin stoneware bowl. You can see how thin those edges are, how lacy those edges are. This is a really beautiful object. If you came up to this object, I think, or to this object in a shop or in a gallery, I think most of us would marvel at it and how beautiful it is. But there is something hidden that is in the creation of this object that can't be put across to an audience without knowledge of how the thing is made. So Adam Zalesny is a young artist from the Czech Republic. And he's going to show you how that piece was made. So he embeds quite powerful explosives in a ball of clay, and what you're looking at are concrete molds, and he is exploding the clay into concrete molds using that beautiful Wile E. Coyote plunger that he had to make himself because you can't get that out of the Granger catalog. Okay, so keep in mind, this is about, I don't know, 40-pound, 50-pound concrete mold. Watch it when the explosive goes off. Watch it lift off the ground. And that is how those bowls are made. So we can ask ourselves where the art lies. Our understanding of the art changes through our knowledge of the process, which is one of the great things about exploring art in one discipline. Many of us have a deep knowledge of ceramics and can look through the objects that are on display here and have a knowledge of how those things are made. And I'm just going to show you that ideas are cyclical, and the Adam Zalesny, who's a young artist, definitely doesn't have the market cornered on blowing things up when it comes to ceramics. One of my favorite ceramic artists, Victor Spinsky, was actually a military ordnance specialist in Vietnam, and he loved blowing things up. This is Pennsylvania-based artist Steve Tobin, and he's got a series of vessels that he calls bang pots. And they're beautiful objects, and I'm actually going to be doing an exhibition of them at the Ceramics Research Center. He textures a block of clay, embeds, I think we used to call those a inch and a halfer when I grew up in Nebraska, and lights them with this torch. And he's put a little bit of extra secret sauce into the video. Oops. The video becomes an art piece in and of itself. If anyone has ever seen Stomp before. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and move on. So people using performance and persona in ceramics certainly goes way back, and in the United States we can at least trace it back to George E. Orr in the late 1800s. Orr was the Mad Potter of Biloxi, and he was given to having an outrageous persona, and he would use that persona and that outrageousness as a way to attract attention to his work. And I don't know if anyone has ever thought of the parallels between George Orr and the current presidential election, but that's certainly something that is on all of our minds. This is a really seminal piece that is very avant-garde in the history of 20th century ceramics. And there was a movement in Japan right after World War II called the Gutai movement. And the Gutai movement involved a core of artists who wanted to, I guess, de-privilege, take away some of the primacy of sculptures and of paintings, and to get people to think of the performance or the act of creation that went into them. So there was all sorts of dangling from the ceiling and making paintings with one's feet. And Kazuo Shiraga did a landmark piece in 1955 called Challenging Mud, in which he laid out several tons of clay, and he got almost naked and wrestled that clay for hours and hours until he was covered in bruises and cuts and scrapes. And I think any of us who is actually a maker in the studio can relate to that struggle with clay. But in the end, it was his own body that was marked up rather than an object that was created from the clay. Robert Rauschenberg actually did an incredible, something I would call a performative piece. He wants you to think of this piece as a painting or as an object or somewhere in between as all of his combines are. And this piece is so underknown in the history of 20th century art. It was created, started in the year 1968 and perfected in 1971. And you can go visit it in the Contemporary Art Museum in Gothenburg in Sweden. And it is just about a ton, I believe, of bentonite mixed with water, and there is compressed air that goes through it that reacts to people walking into the room, and I hope I have it turned up enough. So I think that this is definitely a greatest hit in the world of ceramics that is not well enough known. So California actually plays a really important part in the history of 20th century performance ceramics. And a lot of that goes back to one interesting guy, Lowell Darling, who lives up in Rodeo, California, up in the Bay Area. And he's most famous in California for running for governor against Jerry Brown. I think the first time that Jerry Brown ran, I see some like looks of recognition there. But Lowell was a grad student in ceramics at Southern Illinois University in Carbondale back in the late 1960s. And we're actually living in an era in the 21st century where a lot of young artists are experimenting with unfired clay, experimenting with video. And Lowell Darling really had a lot of this figured out back in 1970 when he created this unfired clay conference that actually happened in Illinois where he was a grad student. And he invited artists from all around the country, including a lot of California artists. Robert Arneson participated in this unfired clay conference. Jim Melchert participated in it. And he solicited the artists, and they had to either come up with a conceptual piece that they could send instructions for a piece to be created out of unfired clay, or they could send it in a box, but they couldn't insure it. And if it broke, so what? So important artists from all over the country corresponded, sent entries, and actually converged on his instructor Nicholas Vergette's farm for several days of unfired clay mayhem. And so here's a conceptual piece, and there was a huge write-up in Craft Horizons magazine about this, and I was able to actually get the archives. We have significant archives at ASU. All of the archives of this festival live in our archives at ASU. The sculptor David Gilhooly, famous for his frog world, sent some incredible instructions for pieces that he would have liked to have been constructed, including a frog Mount Rushmore, a classical sculpture garden with a replica of the Parthenon made entirely of unfired clay, a 6-foot-tall orangutan, a life-size model of the abundance of the Americas, and then finally he left some instructions, he finally left some instructions for a group of unfired clay frogs that were going to be dropped out of a plane into the pond. I don't know that they had access to a plane. Lowell likes to claim that the FAA wouldn't allow him to drop unfired clay frogs from a plane into the pond, but they wound up using a slingshot and shooting unfired clay frogs with a slingshot. So I think AMOCA is totally free to lift any of these or recreate any of these unfired clay pieces if you need something to entertain yourselves. James Melchert is often given a lot of credit for being one of the founding fathers of performance ceramics, and that goes back to a piece that he did in 1972 when he was a visiting artist and a resident in the Netherlands. And he came up with a piece called Changes. This is another one that you could reenact if you'd like. And in Changes, the participants in the performance piece were instructed to dip their heads into liquid slip, and they would sit in a line in a room with fans going on one side and maybe a humidifier going on the other side, And we're invited to kind of meditate and be mindful and experience what it was like for the clay to dry and for one to regain one's senses as you're able to hear and process again. So this was actually recreated several years ago at the Houston Center for Contemporary Art. Jim Melchert here, game, I think at 80 years old, participated in this.
Oh my God.
Is there a bucket of slip out in the studio? So maybe after a few glasses of the wine, we could all meet back there. But this piece has definitely left a mark with several generations in terms of clay being a contemplative process instead of an object-oriented material. Do it! I knew I liked you, AMOCA. Okay, so Kim Dickey is an artist who's a personal hero of mine, and this is work that goes back to the mid-1980s. And she's definitely an artist who picked up the mantle of Judy Chicago and other feminist artists and made pieces that were sometimes raw and shocking, but were definitely performative. And if anyone's going to be in Denver in the next 3 months, Kim Dickey is actually having her mid-career retrospective at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Denver. So I highly recommend a visit to Denver if you're going to be out there. Anyway, we're looking at this gorgeous spouted object. It's kind of made as a pinch pot. Does anyone out there know or want to guess what we're looking at? Kirk does, but...
He's not allowed to.
Kirk, do you have one of these in your collection?
No, but we had him at one of our shows, and I think it may be one of her, I'm not even sure how she titles it, but like a urination pot.
So this is a female urinal that you were looking at. 1985, she made a series of these objects, and it's interesting that since then there are commercial products made out of plastic that you can buy that I think maybe are meant for camping or for fun or whatever, but Kim Dickey really is a pioneer of this. And so she made the objects, and the objects I think are great as thought experiments of their own, but one of the things that she did, oh, and by the way, I'll go back to it. One of the things that she did was started to add multiple spouts, and she wanted to work her way up to maybe 10 spouts, but hydrodynamics, I guess, and pressure doesn't work that well. So she never quite got up to 10 spouts for practical reasons. But rather than making videos herself, she gave the objects to female artist friends of hers, and she invited them to document the pieces. There's nothing graphic in this, but you know. And the artists would take the photographs and were given the pieces in exchange for the documentation. So when these objects were shown, they had to be borrowed from the original artists, and you would, I guess, then see that the objects were used, but the documentation was really in the hands of the users rather than the artists, so to speak. She's also interested in controlling things and documenting her work on her own. So one of the things that she's best known for, making elaborate dinnerware sets for multi-course dinners, but then she would film elaborate videos showing the use of these. And my favorite of all of these videos is a video featuring Peter Hollas, who used to be one of Andy Warhol's superstars and was in several Andy Warhol videos. And he was playing Mephistopheles, consuming a meal out of one of Kim Dickey's dinnerware sets, including some lovely gustatory noises, which I don't think I've included here. gradually the pieces unfolded course by course as Mephistopheles consumes each course. And I think that Kim was living here in LA when she made this piece. Peter Halas, ladies and gentlemen. So I want to get a little touchy-feely again and circle back to that first video that I showed and talk about a piece that's really important in my understanding of clay as a performative material. And Gabriel Orozco, many of you are familiar with his art. He is a big-time blue-chip artist who has had a solo show at MoMA in New York City. And this is a piece that is simply a ball of unfired wet clay that is clutched to the chest and then offered up with a gesture. And in offering it up and clutching it to the chest, it makes a heart-shaped object. And the title of the piece is "My Heart is My Hands." And there is an actual fired object of the heart-shaped lump of clay, but as with Ai Weiwei dropping the ceramic urns, I think all of the art lives in the documentation of the act of clutching clay to one's chest and offering it up. This is another artist who is working in the vein of the first artist from the Czech Republic that I showed you. Her name is Christina Christiansen, and she lives in Denmark. And these are really mysterious objects that live on mysterious pedestals made out of fired glaze. And pondering the process of her actually creating the pieces, I think, is necessary to the understanding of the object. So she created this video that shows you some of her process. So she makes very simple thrown and pinched pots, puts holes in the bottom, and puts glaze that's the consistency of pudding in the bottom, carefully props them in her kiln. And has to place them at exactly the height of the peephole in the kiln so she can keep an eye on them. Gravity at 1280 centigrade. So she watches the pot through the peephole and then crash cools it at just the moment that the glaze has pooled and viscously roped down out of the pieces. Some of us are wet clay geeks, some of us are glaze geeks, and there are glaze geeks who are as equally moved by this as I was by the squishing clay. Okay. The Haas brothers, who live and work here in LA, are brothers. They are furniture designers, and they are not native ceramic makers, but they do offer a line of ceramic vases. These are the Accretion series, and I think they start at about $10,000 a piece. But they bring their outsider's understanding of ceramics to the creation of these mysterious objects.
Being a furniture designer is all about blending the line between design and art. It's all about holding expression over concept, and it's all about being as free as possible and as exploratory as possible with no regret and no limitation to where you can take it.
We decided to make a lamp because we dabbled a little bit in light fixtures. We wanted to explore dim light. The first step in making this design is inspiration. We drew a lot of sketches, talked to our head ceramicist, and then put down a form. At that point, we work with him to coil build the initial form.
The coiling process is a process where you take cords of clay and then you blend those cords together to create a solid wall or a body. So it really allows you to do just about any shape you could possibly want.
The accretion process is a process that we developed after looking at tree fungus, and we were also looking at corals and how they build themselves.
We mimic a very natural sedimentary build-up process. We have an idea in order to make it happen.
So this is the glaze
and the natural
pre-firing
process assists you in that. And there's inherent beauty. If you read it and you're still sensitive to it, you can take it to a place that's beyond what we do in exam.
The glass clock.
Move on. Technology can also be an element for young artists who are working today. This is a group called Unfold who work in Belgium. Does anyone have the game on their phone where they can actually make little pots by sort of nudging a little cylinder of clay? I think it's called like e-pottery or something like that. It's kind of hypnotic. Unfold have created a version of this with a screen and a touch and a sensor that allows you to shape a cylinder of clay, and you can virtually make an object. But the great thing about this piece is that it is connected to a three-dimensional printer that extrudes the clay into the shape that you create. This person spends a whole lot of time on this. Okay, we get it. I do like how irregular and lumpy the piece is. Then with the push of a button, it gets sent off to l'Artisan Electronique, their 3D clay printer, which then builds up the actual piece. I won't bore you with the actual thing, but I wanted you to see the apparatus. There is a thing that you can buy for about $3,500 called the PotterBot that will actually do the same thing. Or if you know your way around a little bit of construction, you can get instructions for making one on your own with some McMaster car parts for a few $100s. So I'm going to talk really briefly, but not spend a lot of time talking about the Recorded Matter show. So I'm obviously interested in this gray line between objects, of which my museum is full, and the creation of the objects, the performance of the objects, the documentation of the use of the objects. And when I was the curator at the clay studio, I started to notice young ceramic artists who were sending in and making these incredible videos. And people have been making videos for a long time that center around ceramics, but there was something very effortless about this. There was something interesting about the way that they blended art and commerce, and in a lot of cases didn't take themselves too seriously. So this is the piece that is in the window of the Recorded Matter show. And it is a game that was created for the artist's thesis project, and you are meant to take the 4 porcelain caps and toss them onto the pegs, which are made of foam. And in the original show, please don't go do this with the caps that are hanging, but AMOCA has actually shown the porcelain caps before, but never the mechanism of the game. And if you're able to get it successfully onto the peg without it breaking, in the original game you were allowed to keep the hat as a souvenir. Here's a photo of one of the large projected installations in our gallery. And this is the first piece that you see when you walk into the gallery, and I want everyone to spend time with this piece tonight. This is an artist named Cheyenne Rudolph who lives in Florida, and Cheyenne has participated in a great tradition of ceramics, and that is creating single-use serving vessels. So in the history of ceramics, if you wanted to show that you were affluent, had good taste, you would have an oyster plate that was for a single purpose, or the modern update, the deviled egg plate with all of the divots in it, a pickle plate. And so Martha Stewart definitely approves of having your table littered with all of these china objects that are single use. So Cheyenne has done that and is solving the problem, which is kind of an imaginary problem, of serving and eating green peas. So the user funnels peas into the funnel up here, and it is portioned into these individual personal pea eaters. And Cheyenne went one great step further because she's really kind of a native performance artist, and she created an infomercial.
Do you believe in etiquette but feel lost and confused?
So what's the first rule of an infomercial?
And lose control.
You have to overstate your problem.
Disaster. Don't let pea mess mar your good name or your good pants.
The lightning bolts coming out of the back.
Your grandmother's famous pea dish is delish. But her outdated fork just won't prick. It's time to say goodbye to pea in the eye. Introducing the personal pea eater, the process that prevents painful pea mess.
Some men on the street interviews.
Yes. What is the meaning of this?
When is the last time you encountered a pea mess?
A pea mess? Oh, I have a pea mess on my pants right now. Excuse me, my eyes are up here, not on my pea mess.
All right, so I'm going to make you experience this in person in the gallery. So with recorded matter, I would say that there is an even balance of showing the use of objects, showing the abuse of some objects, and then showing something that is like an indefinable in-between. And I guarantee you that you've never seen, unless you know this video and this work, that you've never seen clay do what I'm about to show you. So this is an artist named Sam Brennan who made this piece when he was about 20 years old and a student in the UK. So he's got a plaster mold, and he's got an amazing hydraulic extruder. Do you guys have a hydraulic extruder at the studio out here?
Yeah, just an extruder.
Come on, David. Let's. We need a hydraulic extruder. The magic isn't in the hydraulic extruder. It just makes his life a lot easier. Okay, then he puts it on some calcined clay and fires it in the kiln. All right, you ready, everybody? Boom. So rather than glazing it, which would destroy the property that allows it to work like a spring, he dips it in RIT fabric dye. On their side, opened up like slinkies. They're called moire. Ceramic mic drop. All right, this is an artist named Thomas Schmidt and another artist that he works with, Jeffrey Miller. And they were teaching at the main Central Art Academy in Beijing in China. And they had traveled to Jingdezhen, which is the historical home of porcelain. And in Jingdezhen, they produce 1 million pieces of porcelain every day, and they've done so since the imperial era. So wrap your mind around like that 100 years. And they've been producing porcelain in Jingdezhen for 1,200 years. It's where it was invented. So they had access to virtually limitless amounts of fired porcelain objects that were were imperfect. They would ship them to Beijing, and then for effect and utility, they rented a steamroller. Notice that they're just getting the steamroller out of a truck with some like 2x4s, which is very China. The sound of this on headphones is really great. Then they take all of the shards and they collaborate with an aluminum foundry and they pour molten aluminum down onto the shards, making them into tiles, artworks, functional objects. So one of the rare actual objects that's displayed in the exhibition is one of these panels. So I invite you to marvel at it and to imagine your backsplash at home in your kitchen made out of these fractured porcelain pieces. There's an up-close image. This is usually when I am touring high school groups or middle school groups through the exhibition where I start. So I mentioned that some of these videos are about objects being used and some of them are about them being abused. So Man Yao is an artist from Finland. So there's an artist from Finland, an artist from the UK, an artist from Switzerland, 2 American artists working in China. Recorded Matter is a very international exhibition. And so these are porcelain skateboard decks that are made by the artist Man Yao. She worked with professional videographers and a professional skateboarder to make this video. So it's amazing how much abuse these porcelain skateboard decks can hold up to until they don't.
Oh, there you go.
If anyone needs to look away here. Okay. So I invite you to watch the entire video inside. So this is a young artist who just graduated from Columbia University in New York several years ago. Her name is Bree Way, and she combines the intense physicality of a Peter Volkos with the conceptual art of a Sol LeWitt. So she always starts out with a lump of clay that is equal to the mass of her body. And she writes instructions before she creates the piece. And the creation of the piece and the physicality of the creation of the piece is very much integral to the final piece. So here are the instructions for Stationary Forward Spread of 2015. Start with a pile of 130 pounds of clay. Plant your knees in the pile of clay. Push the clay forward and away from your knees. Spread the clay as far as you can reach without lifting your knees from the floor. No need to spread it left, right, or behind. Just think about moving it forward, tracing the motions of forward movement. Stop before wearing through the floor. Stop when you cannot spread it further. Stand up and with a knife cut the clay into small divisions, like detail shots of a larger image. And I think the writing, I think the language is important to her. So anyone who knows M.C. Richards and the history of poetry interacting with ceramics, all of that is cooked into her art. And I think the ultimate thing that makes her work really attractive to me is the final objects are incredible. I think we've all been into art museums and have seen goopy, like physical, sort of untrained looking work. And she's very careful about how she glazes, finishes, and hangs these pieces. And the objects have this incredible power to me. All right, I'm gonna come full circle here. And we started out by talking about writing about art, or talking about art being like dancing about architecture. But as I hinted when I was talking about Bree Way here, sometimes words are really important to the understanding of objects. And poetry is sometimes cooked into the process of making. So all of that said, I do a lot of writing, I do a lot of curating, and one of my great heroes was the writer, the editor, Rose Slifka. And Rose Slifka, for a long time, was the editor of what I still believe is the most incredible craft magazine or journal ever to have been published, which is Craft Horizons, which ceased publications in 1980, I believe, which became American Craft Magazine, which is just kind of a different animal. But Craft Horizons often brought in poets to review exhibitions. They often talked about dance performances, and they were really beautiful objects as well. So I don't know if maybe there's a collection of Craft Horizons in the archive here, but if you haven't looked through Craft Horizons, you owe yourself to it. So Rose Slifka was someone who wrote in a way that was as visceral to me as seeing those hands touching and gooping the clay. And there was no one that she was more visceral in writing about than Peter Volkos. And there was a lifelong kind of relationship between Rose Slifka and Peter Volkos. Rose Slifka wrote a really important article called The New Ceramic Presence that really gave people a way to understand the work of John Mason and Peter Volkos and other artists in the late 1950s and 60s who brought an expressive quality to clay. And I don't know if you've ever considered the way that Rose Slifka wrote about Peter Volkos, or even just the pure power of watching Peter Volkos work. I had the pleasure of getting to watch Peter Volkos work once, and it was a transformative experience to me. So we have arrived at the end of the lecture, and we have arrived at the erotic poetry reading, those of you who are heading out. So I'm going to play a little video mashup that I put together that's showing Peter Volkos working, and I'm going to read a passage of Rose Slifka's writing to accompany it. So, ladies and gentlemen, my erotic poetry reading. To watch Peter Volkos bear down on a mound of clay and draw up the walls of the spinning cylinder is to watch power, great strength, total balance, absolute control, the rhythms of the man and the clay at one with each other, pitched precisely to the clay in his hand. Natural action, smooth and continuous, nothing forced, nothing contrived, mark the movement between the man and the clay. There's a sense of unfailing precision and grace in that powerful, hulking body. He works rapidly and obsessively, and at the same time is unhurried, even leisurely. At the wheel, Volkos stands firmly planted, legs apart, like an immobile pyramid facing its opposite. The turning sphere, a yin and yang confrontation. As Volkos says, the whole thing is yourself being in balance. If you're not balanced, it's a strain. It's all in being centered. The entire presence of Peter Volkos carries the vitality of that connection of the hand, working with the heart, brain, muscle, nerve, graded for action. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.